face.
No, not quite, not quite. I don't need my iPad.
I'm just deleting surnames quickly.
Like storming here.
Is it?
So nice.
Our lights actually flickered now.
Yeah, there's a big storm forecast for the Cape.
Good evening and welcome, and thank you for joining us. This evening we will be discussing lean portfolio management, what it is and the role it plays in unlocking business agility. I am Natalie, an Agile consultant at IQ Business, and this evening I'm joined by my colleagues, Biase, partner and Agile consultant, and Josi, a manager and Agile consultant. And then our very special guests, Lara and Zane, from one of our largest and oldest insurance companies, Old Mutual. Lara is the head of strategy and innovation for Mass Foundation Cluster, MFC, and Zane looks after business change execution and is the driving force behind the broader Agile transformation within MFC. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us this evening. So we're going to jump right in and get started, and what better place to start than with the what and why of LPM. So Biase, over to you.
Thanks, Natalie, and thanks, Zane and Laura, for joining us, and Josi as well. Yeah, as always, I think these sessions, we want to have a real informal but formal conversation about things, about agility and business agility. And today, I think lean portfolio management is a hot topic around how do we unlock business agility. So we're going to kind of cover that today, talk a little bit about the why and the what and how, some of those patterns. But really the important part is the conversation that will happen afterwards. And we'll ask Zane and Laura some not so difficult questions, but a little bit of stories and sharing some of the experiences in adopting lean portfolio management within the organization. So I think from that point of view, I think let's get started. I think in first point is I want to get your view. So experimentation is always good, right? So let's see how we can do this. Is we're going to run a Menti Meter. So for those that are not used to a Menti Meter, if you go to menti.com, I'll go again, menti.com, and you type in the code 96539238, or use the QR code, or use the URL that is positioned there. It will give you a couple of options there. I'm going to put up the Menti Meter now, and then as we'll wait a few seconds, obviously there's a little bit of a delay in getting the results through. So as the results are coming through, we just want to get your opinion. And the questions are as far as, what are your 3 biggest pain points with regards to managing your portfolio? So it talks about gaps in clarity, strategic clarity and rigid funding models, focus on outputs rather than outcomes, lack of alignment causing serious delivery friction. Let me make this actually make this so we can see everything is cutting off a little bit. Constant people shifting and no clear understanding of capacity, informal and ineffective prioritization practices, no single point of entry due to lacking qualification process, false illusion of progress by starting new initiatives, consistently taking on too much work, and annual planning is painful and ineffective. So let's see. I think there's a little, like I said, a little bit of a delay, and there's lots to go through. But just pick your top 3 biggest pain points that you've experienced within your organization. Maybe you haven't been exposed to the broader portfolio management or what you can expect. And let's hope that this comes through. Otherwise, we'll just go into the next slide. Hey, how's that?
Yes, do you mind sharing the code again?
The code is on the top of the screen. It's 96539238. So if you go to www, only 3 W's, .menti.com, and type in the code 96539238. I'm assuming, Natalie, you're trying. Oh, there's people coming through. All right, cool. So we'll give it a few seconds. So typically we have to start with the why, right? As you guys are voting and providing some input into that. currently we only have one boat, is to understand why is it important to talk about shifting from what we call traditional portfolio management to that of lean portfolio management. Just want to make sure. I've got to ensure that I am sharing my screen. Cool. Is it now up?
Yeah, it's about. Now we can
Wasn't
see
it up
it.
before?
No,
Okay, you need to tell me. Otherwise it won't work.
I thought I was going crazy.
I thought you were testing our memory.
Yeah. There you go, as you go. So we start seeing the score. So the screen is up there. We start seeing, it can look like dot voting, where it is. So I'm going to give a few seconds there for those to come through from the audience. And starting to see a little bit of patterns. Now, oftentimes we do this when we're doing our lean portfolio management courses or when we're discussing lean portfolio management with our customers. And we tend to see very similar patterns and issues. And kind of interesting, we talk about our challenges that exist. And oftentimes our customers say, well, our environment is unique to others. But when we do the same exercise with other customers, they come up with the same problems, right? To be honest. So carry on voting. What we're going to do is let's move on and we'll come back a little bit later. So whilst it's happening, because there's lots to read through, realize there's probably too many options, and that's one of the challenges we've got here. So if we had to compare to what we call, and let me put the slides back up. Okay, traditional project management. So we talk about why lean portfolio management. Well, if you think about traditional portfolio management offices, they obviously serve a purpose. They serve a purpose around executing on these large ticket initiatives, ensuring that, and I guess it depends on the type and size and structure of those PMOs. You know, some PMOs just provide project management and business analysis capacity. Other involved, you know, the end-to-end value chain of project management and the program management office. But ultimately, what we're trying to think about is this current world that we live in. We know that we live in this very complex environment, lots of disruption that is happening. And how do we create an environment or a PMO that is able to adapt much faster to the shifts in what is happening in the environment, both from a market and a customer, political, etc., to create what we call strategic agility. The opportunity to pivot when needed, depending on where we are. And obviously, if these PMOs and these organizations are committed to these 3-year, 5-year, 8-year, 10-year programs, the opportunity to pivot is going to be much reduced. So how do we create an environment where we can adapt, as we talk about business agility, the ability to adapt to changes in order to give us a competitive advantage? So Josi, can you give us a little bit of a view of what, now giving you the why, we understand that. We're going to come back to the Menti Meter a little bit later. But maybe you want to talk a little bit about the what.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. And good afternoon, everybody. So LPM applies systems thinking to create an intake system to manage the flow of our enterprise portfolio work and how we get that work down to our teams. We also use LPM to determine the way that the work is going to be governed. But most important of all is how we align strategy to execution in order to deliver the value that's most important to our customers. So LPM is very instrumental in setting the direction, understanding the current state of a portfolio or an organization, and then plotting the course for how we move to a better future state. So in our approach as IQ Business, we've considered both the enterprise business agility through the agility health environment, as well as scaled agile framework, SAFE, in terms of building out our LPM offering, which then obviously makes us the best of both worlds, but cognizant of emerging practices and patterns in both those frameworks. So lean portfolio management to me really focuses on bringing about the clarity of measurable goals that we set for a particular portfolio, and we document these particular goals through strategic themes, objectives, and key results. And then what we really want to do is we want to make sure that we're focused on the outcomes as opposed to the outputs, and that we do this through creating vision and portfolio roadmaps that bring about clarity for everybody else in the environment, in the portfolio for the longer term. We prioritize these initiatives, these largest initiatives in our environment. And what we do is then we get together and we do quarterly planning to make sure that we can map the demand to the capacity that we have, and that we provide an opportunity to do agile delivery and have the adaptability through those quarterly planning cycles, with the most important work being top of mind. We then also go through execution, where we're really trying to coordinate across the value streams that we create, and we'll talk a little bit more about what those value streams are, the different types. And really what we're trying to do is find those differentiating opportunities that exist within an organization, within a portfolio, which really give the organization the edge and make it difficult for the competition to compete or to deliver something very similar in that regard. And then very, very important as well in that execution phase is getting a handle on our dependencies. So we support the execution by establishing a cadence, and we look at the most successful patterns that we use in delivery, and we at a lower level try to follow a program level roadmap, which is giving explicit clarity to the teams on what is top of mind for the next quarter that we are going to be delivering. And we coordinate that across the value streams within the portfolio to make sure that we stay aligned to those strategies. And we also foster operational excellence in that execution phase, where we're driving efficiencies, we're driving performance, and we're also driving continuous improvement of the practices, but most importantly, the results for our customers. And we do this through our reporting, we do this through our agile contracting, and the key performance indicators that we set for ourselves when we establish those value streams. Then we take a balanced approach to governance and compliance. This is always essential and a very topical question or topic that you find. How do we balance audit, compliance, and the speed of delivery whilst being efficient? So we have these guardrails which help us manage our expenditure. We coordinate the compliance and the audit activities by taking an iterative approach for those particular activities as well. And in so doing, we bring about those standards and the regulatory requirements as part of the journey, as opposed to trying to bolt them on right at the end. We get ourselves into a better position in terms of being able to forecast our expenses and then create the ability to dynamically adjust our budgets as things change, so we are able to respond to those particular challenges. And then we measure the most important thing, measuring our performance and the strategies that we're implementing, and we stay very focused on the benefits realization. I think this is something that we spend a lot of time upfront when we're doing comprehensive business cases, but we don't typically hold ourselves accountable to the benefits realization. And the key elements in terms of the metrics that we look at there is obviously making sure the well-being of our people, so our engagement, employee engagement type activities. We look at net performance scores in order to make sure that our customers are happy with what we're doing. We make sure that our partner relationships are in a good space. And then we constantly measure our maturity by doing different assessments across the various competencies within LPM. And then we, once again, track our predictability, quality, and our progress against those key performance indicators that we set for our value streams. So following on that note, yeah?
Yeah, just a general comment. I mean, I think we're dealing with large corporates a lot of the time. So when we talk about business agility and we talk about scaling agile, a lot of this comment comes around like, what about governance? What about process? What about our, and we always say, like, you've got to balance. I mean, just talk about the last one as an important point. You always got to balance what is lean processes and the what we call the efficiency and effectiveness of the process versus the speed of innovation and agility. And you've got to balance that in all corporate, because we work with highly regulated industries, banking, insurance, etc. You're not going to go throw away all this governance processes and compliance processes. So you have to find that balance. I think it's an important one. But let's move on to the next picture.
Right. So, I mean, important here is that, well, we have to get a handle on this work and the flow, and how do we do that? So essentially the picture is illustrating that we have strategic initiatives flowing in on the left in a funnel system, which is creating an element of demand. And then further on the right to the top, you see another funnel, which is bringing about all the operational and support and sustainability type initiatives that you typically have in an organization. And you can see that's also feeding into potentially a common capacity for handling the supply around those particular initiatives, and then also an element of validation. So typically what we do here is we put things into a Kanban system, and really a Kanban system is an information radiator, which is earmarked to give us signals about where we are, what the state of work is, where we're having trouble, what are the bottlenecks that we need to deal with. So typically what you do is create this Kanban board, and you would bring initiatives into these funnels. You would do a review of these initiatives. These initiatives are the largest, most important initiatives, typically known in the SAFe world as epics, that would need some kind of approval and funding, and maybe even an experiment or a minimum viable product. And what you would typically do then is you would build an epic hypothesis statement that would describe this particular initiative effectively. It will talk about the benefits of moving from the status quo to a future state. It would talk about the indicators, the leading and the trailing indicators that you would use to validate that hypothesis, and touch on some of the non-functional requirements for that particular initiative. That would give you sufficient grounding in order to make a decision as to whether this is something worth doing further analysis on, where you would go and do a lightweight business case, maybe define a minimum viable product, and ultimately the aim there is to draw on your lean portfolio management capability to get you the go or no-go decision. Have an epic owner defined that's going to be responsible for shepherding this particular initiative through the system in order to ultimately come back and say whether or not the minimum viable product has been validated and that we should pursue with the full potential of this particular initiative. So this portfolio Kanban is really one of those tools that help us visualize the work in different stages of implementation, and also helps us manage the amount of work that is in the system. Many a times we find it very difficult to have alignment between the executives, the senior management layer within an organization, and those people and teams that are doing the work, in terms of just what are the people doing? Where am I spending my money, and how am I getting the return? And this Kanban system is geared to do exactly that. As part of the system, we go through prioritization in various phases, and it's very important that you build a prioritization framework that makes sense for your organization. The frameworks we've spoken about obviously give you some insights as to what you could do to prioritize. Most importantly, we're not trying to eliminate things, but we're trying to sequence things in terms of implementation that's going to give you maximum return for your value proposition. And we consider things like risk, cost, size, duration, value, and also the implications of not doing it. So what is the cost of delaying the implementation of a particular initiative, and then offsetting that against the duration and the effort required to implement that particular initiative. And that doesn't have to be specific to software delivery only. This can also be applied to your most important business initiatives. It could be a marketing campaign. It could be some kind of regulatory initiative, whatever it might be, right? And then what you do is, obviously, as you see it flowing through this picture, you take the demand of those strategic initiatives and you blend it with those operational and sustainability issues against the policy which defines how you want to spend your money in terms of new ideas for growth, some great ideas that you want to expand on, or maybe some of the things that you need to do in rectifying technical debt and things like that from a more of a BAU perspective. So bringing that into the mix and then making that available for your teams to implement at their next planning boundary, known either as quarterly planning, big group planning, or PI planning, in order to bring that to the fore. And that gets managed by your typical triad, the product management architecture and release train engineers that help plan that work in preparation for your PI planning scenario. Right, and then most importantly, in order to hit that target on the right-hand side, that validation, what you're really trying to do is either prove that hypothesis either by some kind of experiment prototyping, but sometimes you actually build a solution that meets that MVP and you put it into production to a certain degree, and you then work out and validate whether that actual minimum viable product meets the hypothesis, where you then make a decision either to pivot and do something else, or pivot to something which is a slightly different nuance to the original epic. You put it back into the Kanban system, you evaluate it, and you make a decision as to whether you do that or not. Or alternatively, you make a decision to stop that outright. So that's typically how we manage the flow. That's how we get a handle on the capacity. Biase is smiling. Why are you
smiling? Because you make it sound so easy, but it really
simple.
isn't. It's so easy, Josi. We just do that. But we'll come back to that, to some of the challenges that we're experiencing. I think, look, I'm not going to go. I think Josi's touched on quite a lot of this stuff already. And these are just nice patterns. So if you go to the enterprise business agility model from Agility Health, just as a reference to them, just they come up with 10 patterns, and I think some of you may have seen this or not, I'm not sure, but ultimately I'm not going to go through in too much detail, but just very high level around what these patterns are. So the first one is looking at strategy and investment. Obviously, strategy development is a domain on its own, right? How do we understand the vision, the mission of the organization? Typically, that is a common process, right? And kind of interesting, we get executives that will go away, they'll do their strategy development, maybe get external parties to validate their stuff. But most of the strategies that I've seen nowadays are very similar, right? I can always talk about digitally led organizations, customer-centric, all those good optimization of costs. Those are all more or less the same, but it's in execution that we need to think about. But the strategy is about the longer term view. So we talk about agility. We need the longer term view. We need a 3-year view, a 5-year view. We also need the ability to adapt if that view changes, right? Anybody know about the pandemic? Well, we couldn't plan for that, but we had to pivot. The second part of it is how do we translate that into what we call a set of objectives, as Josi mentioned. So the patterns and the practice of the tools, something called OKRs. Very deep in the theory and the knowledge behind it. So if you want to go back to Intel and Andy Grove, I think it was, and all that kind of theory behind it. But the application of that is about how do we identify, not about measuring the outputs, but rather the outcomes, those actual things, and how do we look at the actual metrics behind it, the key results, leading and lagging indicators. But then we have to get alignment. So here's the thing, OKRs don't cascade. Those objectives don't cascade. They need to be aligned, right? And we create alignment both vertically and horizontally. We do that across the structure of organizations in the leadership layer. It's not an easy thing to get right. What is also important on the other side, as we mentioned, is understand what your target, your current versus target. So one of the things that you first want to do, right? I mean, and I think we'll talk about it later with Zane and Laura, but actually understand where your capacity is going. Because we can't plan for 100% transformation work or change work if your current capacity is sitting on 80% or 90% or keeping the lights on. So the first part is understand what it currently is and then move towards a target. Use, as we say, economic decision-making framework to prioritize the work coming in and all the way down, by the way. So not only at the portfolio level, but also at the team level. Now you've got a view of what your target capacity is around run, grow, transform. You've got these buckets. You can then go through this quarterly planning to try and manage the demand and the capacity, right? And review that on a quarterly basis. We then, as we said, in Agile world, right, we want to make things as visible as possible. So using a Kanban system, using all your, obviously pre-lockdown, having these physical environments where you can actually physically see the state of the portfolio. Like when people ask me, like, where do you start with portfolio management? I say, just put your current projects on a board. Where is it, right? And by doing that, you can also already start identifying the bottlenecks in where you need to come and look at it. If everything's in the build process, Well, guess what? That's where your capacity is currently spending their time on. So it's part of that kind of making things as visible as possible, because if you can't see the work, you can't manage it, you can't see the impediments, the blockers, and you can't improve the flow. We also have to measure the performance, and Josi's mentioned about that as well, but also to measure the maturity of the lean portfolio management function. And this is often what happens. It's, the new word that Saif is talking about from a PMO point of view is something called a value management office, a VMO. I know we just put titles to things, but ultimately that's what we're trying to do, right, as a PMO, is to enable value in the organization. And this kind of triad between strategy and initiative funding, the executing of the portfolio, as well as the governance side, needs to work in collaboration together, right? How does this all pan out? So I think this kind of gives a view, and it's quite busy, but just to explain to you that we have a bigger picture view around the enterprise. Now, when we translate that longer term view into the portfolio, you have to understand what those outcomes are for that year. So now we have a longer term horizon of 3 years. For the portfolio, you might want to look at for an annual perspective and a longer roadmap. But we want to invest in what we call those epics and capabilities, right? That's what we want to look at that point in time. When we go down to the portfolio or the team of teams level, so whether you're doing tribes or chapter or tribes or arts or whatever you want to call them, it's about the quarterly focus. So we then have to translate those objectives and key results that sit at the portfolio for that year into quarterly views. So we're continuously reviewing whether we are realizing those benefits that we promise from an organization point of view. This is quite important because as part of business planning, what normally happens in organizations is that as a result of scorecards, the executives will commit to landing initiatives rather than commit to actually achieving the outcomes. I know maybe that's a broad generalist statement, but it's part of that process, right? So how do we shift that thinking? Because then it creates flexibility and agility in how we achieve those outcomes. We're not tied to landing a specific initiative. And that's what normally happens. If we commit to an initiative and it's part of our scorecard or part of how we measure the performance of the portfolio, we'll make sure that that thing is delivered no matter what, even though we realize that maybe those benefits are not going to be realized. And then obviously at the team level, we have that kind of review, right? I'm just looking at time, Josi. There's a shift between, and we want to have a conversation. We said 25 minutes from a talk. So I'm going to skip the next slide because we'll come back to that maybe a little bit later. But just, some of the benefits, and I think we'll talk through that, is we do want to, if we talk about value streams, is removing flow, removing some of those barriers, those functional structures. So because we want to organize around value, right? That's one of the principles that we talk about. That means that we shift the thinking that work doesn't happen in a functional silo, but actually work flows across. So we want to organize around that. So that will improve the flow. We spoke about outcomes. We spoke about creating transparency. Ultimately, right? Ultimately, it doesn't matter what we do. What we're trying to do is better value delivery to the customer, right? And deliver the right things to the customer at speed. I think that's the most important thing at the moment. Josi, are you okay? If can we come back to that a little bit later? I just want to make sure that we have enough time for the conversation. Rather than going through the slides, if that's okay. Natalie, we'll come back over to you. I feel like
awesome.
I feel like those news presenters. Natalie, over to you.
Over to you. And then there's the silence as they connect across countries.
Yeah, and the guy's like, with the sports.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Josi and Biase, and maybe Biase, we can also come back to seeing what the Menti results came out as. So having recently embarked on an adoption of lean portfolio management, we would like to hear from Zane and Lara what experiences and challenges they are having. Because I think as Biase said before, it sounds easy and it sounds great in theory, but the practical, although powerful, is a challenge, a daily challenge, and it really is a big decision to embark on, and it isn't easy. So I think hearing what you have been experiencing, the challenges, and then I know one of the last questions we have are some tips and advice that you can offer to people on the ground. As we're having this conversation, and I see there are 2 comments already in the chat, please feel free to post your questions, and we will spend some time at the end answering as many of those questions as we can. So it was so funny. I have something up on my screen, and Zane, you tilted to the side. It looks like you're going around it. So thank you again, Laura and Zane, for joining us and for being willing to share your experiences and insights. Zane, having recently embarked on this journey, like I said, what triggered, because you had already embarked at a team level on an agile transformation, what triggered the progression to lean portfolio management?
Thanks, Natalie. I think for us, we kind of took the teams on a journey, and we were still struggling a lot in terms of demand, the way we were planning our portfolios, the way we fund portfolios. Our processes are quite traditional. So we do the annual plans, we allocate the funding annually. And so there isn't room and flexibility, to adapt when change happens during the year. And it's quite painful, actually, because we've then committed to these longer term things. And so every time something new comes in or something changes, we also have to go through quite a rigorous governance process to kind of, just get that approved before we even start working on it. So with LPM, we found, I would say, a method or a framework to really bring finance, strategy, and execution closer together. We've also now started looking at doing this in iterations. And with doing that, we find that there's a lot more space for change. It's still painful, but we're definitely starting to feel that it's flowing a lot more.
Okay, yeah. And I think just to point out the working more in iterations, but I know that the approach that you're also taking to lean portfolio management isn't big bang. It is evolutionary. And I think that's also something important to remember when transitioning to this, is it's not something that's going to happen overnight, and it's not going to happen all at once. You've got to pick a starting point. To actually come back to just now is understanding what you chose as your starting point and why. But before that, Laura, as the head of strategy and innovation, how do you see the adoption of LPM supporting the achievement of your strategic objectives? What is your hope?
Yeah, thanks for that, Natalie. Good question. And maybe it also speaks to the strategy execution journey that we've been on and how those two things have kind of dovetailed. So, people on the webinar might be aware of that quote from Morris Chang about without strategy, execution is aimless, and without execution, strategy is useless. So we really didn't want to find ourselves in either of those buckets. And that's why we had started to shift the way we executed strategy. I think Biase and Josi have both made good points about how strategy planning works in organizations. And we kind of realized that you can put a lot of words on a slide, but if you're not actually getting the outcomes that you want, then people are just involved in effort. They're getting tired, but you're not really seeing an outcome, nothing that benefits the customer. So we had started a journey where we started looking at strategy execution methodologies. We incorporated some balanced scorecard. And with that, you talk about strategy cascade or strategy alignment, moving through pillars and themes and objectives and key results. So when you kind of look at the LPM workbook and the tagline under that is aligning strategy with execution, I mean, your eyes obviously light up. I mean, there must be something in there. And I guess we were lucky in terms of that journey dovetailing with what Zane was then seeing and how we then brought that together. And if we then have that proper alignment, what we then have is the levers, the objectives, the key results being used in the same way in terms of how we then develop business cases, how we talk about delivering value. And that's the natural kind of alignment that we're seeing in the business. So if we're getting smarter, crisper about those themes, how they're getting into outcomes, that's the benefit that we're seeing. So to deliver value. And linked to that is the group is actually starting to talk about value drivers. And if you've got these value streams and value delivery and a key focus, we do see those things then coming together to benefit our customers and multiple stakeholders.
And I think if we think about a very small organization of say 30 or 100 people, the distance between that strategy and the people executing, I mean, everyone's together all the time. But in an organization the size of Old Mutual, there's so much space between those two. Something Zane and I were having, Zane, something you said a while ago when we were chatting, which I think is quite great about the journey that Old Mutual is going on, is there's work happening at the bottom here, the execution layer, to ready it to be able to execute more flexibly, be more flexible in the way we execute. And then there's work happening at the top here to ensure that the information coming to those teams is in such a way that they can execute effectively. And I think the mix between how you're structured, how information flows, as well as the value of that information is ultimately what gives us the agility and the ability to execute on that strategy. I don't know, Biase, Josi, if there's anything, please just jump in.
We were actually talking about with Josi in preparing for the conversation today. It was like we did this piece of work for another customer in outside of South Africa, and part of the LPM function was to get people with a shared understanding of what the strategy was. So maybe not, but openly we kind of did this exco session, and we asked them to map the strategy. It's kind of interesting. Not everybody in the exco knew what the strategic drivers were for the organization. But now that's what I'm saying. The point is, like, the thing is, like, how do we create that shared understanding of what that is, the why, right? What the direction in which we're going on. And that's great because it gives us direction. It gives us a clarity of where we're going to go, and we have to align around that ultimately. And I think that's the thing around teams being able to do that.
One of the banks that I was working with years ago, they, in the one area, the exco decided that every single one of their objectives that was part of their strategy was going to be written in plain, simple primary school English, so that there could be no misunderstanding as to what it is they wanted to achieve. And it was amazing, actually. It was so refreshing to go, okay, this is the goal. That's it. So next question, because we have mentioned that there are multiple components to being able to achieve this. And maybe Biase, to provide guidance on where you started with Mass Foundation Cluster, what was the starting point in terms of implementing LPM and why?
Is carefully the right answer. No. So look, I mean, I think the reality is we come across as, these agile, I always like joking in the workshops we do, like these agile ninjas on a unicorn, right? And we sell the agile Kool-Aid, right? And you've got to be agile, etc., etc. But the important part is to meet the customer where they're at. I know that sounds cliched, but it's important that Zane and Lara were going through this journey at a specific pace. And Zane will tell me that it's not fast enough, but I believe that it's at the right pace. It's the right pace in which the organization can handle this change. So if you go with Big Bang, right, what's going to happen? You're going to meet with immediate resistance. All those stuff that Josi was talking about, that's not easy to implement within an organization that has got legacy processes, etc. So I joke about carefully, but carefully is the right thing. I mean, I like to hear Zane's view around it, because I think was on the other side of it. But I was like, yeah, let's take you on the journey and we'll co-create this with you, because that's the important part. Your context might be different. You might have some of the same challenges, but your context is different to the other organizations and the other areas within your organization. So let's build this roadmap together. I think that was important. Zane?
So how we started, like I said, we started with setting up kind of our teams. And so we focused at that team level, and we very quickly realized that, well, these teams need to work together. And there are so many dependencies across these teams. And so how do they all plan together? And so we introduced the concept of an agile release train, but across our portfolio of change. So everybody comes together now on a quarterly basis and plans together for the next quarter. That's what we started with. We obviously are working remotely, so we literally bring Laura in every quarter when we do PI planning, and she shares the strategy. And she shares what the things that have been sequenced for the next quarter, not what, but how they then are going to help us to take the next step to achieving the strategy. We also introduced some of the framework around WSJF, which I saw Michelle posted there. So the wait is short is job first.
That's your J first.
And even with introducing that framework, we had to introduce it at different levels, so it's complicated. So when we talk to the EXCO about epic sequencing versus when we talk to the teams around feature sequencing, it looks different. So we've kind of went through a journey to figure that out, and we're still kind of inspecting and adapting on that one. And then I think the third thing was creating this single backlog of change. So we really put together everything around strategic initiatives, regulatory, BAU, and IT optimization, because the truth is there's a single set of capacity that needs to work on it all. And so when we look at prioritization or value or cost of delay, they need to sit next to each other. And we need to use that as a consistent approach to really look at what is going to give us the most value. Or in the case of regulatory, what is the biggest risk, in terms of cost of delay. And then PI planning, spoke about that. We now plan for in 12-week increments. We bring people like legal and product and our shared services, into a room. That's so powerful that we're doing that. We now have a view of our work, so everything's visible, all our dependencies are visible. We can map and show to EXCO for the first time how much time we're spending on what type of work. In the last quarter, we spent 71% of our capacity on regulatory. We just completed PI3 planning, and it's gone down to 36%. So we can see how, as the demand shifts and as our environment shifts, what our capacity is kind of being used on. And so there we've seen a lot of benefit. The next step for us is to look at our incoming or new demand for 2020 and how we're going to refine our portfolio Kanban process, introduce that epic hypotheses concept. And then I suppose, like Pia says, carefully tread forward.
But I wanted to just make a comment. Sorry to interrupt, because I'm sure Laura to also talk to you. But the one thing when we started, I remember the first workshop we did. I don't know if you remember, we had the idea boards, and what I did was I used these specific patterns, and we kind of did a bit of a maturity assessment. It was a bit of a thing. And then we said, okay, well, what are the quick wins here? Next minute, Zane and team already had implemented. So I think there's also a view of that, right? So we said, one of the first things is, what is the capacity allocation? And then they did it. So I think that's also part of it, is we created an iterative approach, but I think, Zane, you picked some of those quick wins and started implementing them very quickly. I think, and got results immediately so that you can build some momentum. I think that's kudos to you and the team.
I remember Biase was probably in 2019 sometime, I asked you, like, how am I going to get Exco to fund this? You know, it's like, it's going to cost us millions. And you said, show some value. You know, do little things that's going to show value, and they will start investing. And we are there now. I mean, the reality is we are investing in new ways of work every year over some other things. So that approach is working.
Laura, I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
No, comfortable. I think Zane's covered it.
So I think before you share some wisdom with everyone, what is the thing that you have found most challenging on this journey? Either Zane or Laura.
I can maybe talk from what it's been like in terms of socializing and getting some buy-in. And Zane can certainly add, I think, on what has happened in the segment versus at group level. So there is a certain level of knowledge about what the benefits of LPM can bring across the board, and people at different levels of maturity. And you can hear that MFC has really, grabbed the reins, and we see value, and we have done great things already. So how do we also, because we run cross-functional projects, we run programs that have links to group. So where are people in that when we start talking a certain language becomes important? And we will find our way. I think we've already made some great strides this year. And also, I think Biase mentioned the points about corporates, really large institutions. And the question can be, if we're large, we're significant, we're already successful, why should we change? And also, if it's not broken, what needs to be fixed? And also, you make certain promises, certain things that are on your scorecard. Yes, also already made that point about what you need to deliver in a year. So if you've only got mind space and physical capacity to do those things, how do you then create space to learn something new, actually implement it? Most of that's going to be on the side. I mean, I already know the hours that Zane works in order to deliver these changes. So there's a little bit of that. And then also, highly regulated, we've spoken about the regulatory capacity, where are the sign-offs, that all of those things come into play. And then just the recognition in a challenge about people learn things at different paces. So you really have to understand that playing field, so where are people, what is required to make the soil fertile, when do you plant the seed, being comfortable that the seed ain't gonna grow in a particular season, make peace with that, try again. So just that aptitude and pace of change is important. And also finding out who the custodian of the change is. If you take an example, if Zane is running ahead, she sees value. Does it then become her baby? Should we then get the MD to drive? Is it a culture shift? Is it Zane's boss? Is it strategy? So those things are also evolving. And we're at a nice point now where I think there's a multifunctional SWAT team, if you want to call it that, that needs to take and drive this thing, and also with some input coming from group. But those have been challenges because, if nobody owns it, nobody's grabbing it, these things fall through the cracks, and you kind of like hope for the best. So those are the things that we're trying to shift as well. Zane, I'm sure you
becomes one person.
Yeah.
Thanks, Laura. I would say that I definitely agree with Laura. When kind of one area drives this change, it is difficult because the reality is you can't do it alone. And so a challenge is that you will take one step forward and 3 steps back because you might have forgotten about somebody or somebody might just not, you thought they were next to you, but they wouldn't. So that is challenging. The other challenge for us, like Laura said, is in our segment, we're kind of ahead of the game. And so we're also waiting for the group level to, who will actually set the guidance for us. We kind of have to stay close to them so that they don't change what we've already done completely or too much. And And then for me personally, it's been challenging and I mean, I can't speak about myself because I'm not doing this alone, but, you know, when you are learning about something new, because it is brand new for us. So you have to learn it, you have to try it, and then you have to sell it and influence other people, you know, while you're still learning. That is quite difficult. But I suppose it helps you with the skill, should I say, of that it's okay to say I don't know. You know, it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to say I don't know. Actually, can we meet again? Let me go and find out. But that is a challenge because when you're trying to sell something to Exco, you know, you feel like you want to know the answers. So that's been hard. Yeah, and then I think learning, you know, new things for people who are so used to just doing things in a certain way. It's a complete mindset shift. It's a complete culture shift. That is difficult. I don't think it's difficult for us only. So there's a lot of socialization, change management that's, you know, constantly needed.
So for people that are interested in possibly embarking on this journey or have already, what advice would you share with them or tips?
I'm going to start by saying something that Kevin is always saying to us. Just start with where you are. So that, you know, that's kind of always what we do. We start with where we are, and then we inspect and adapt as we go along. And we have to constantly remind the team, the task team was working on this, and ourselves, that it's okay if it's not perfect. We're going to do it anyway. We're going to try it. And, you know, we go as far as telling people, this might be a mess, but we're going to do it anyway. And, you know, forgive us, give us the space. And we're lucky in that we have been able to do that. Because I think they trust us enough that we won't drop the ball completely. And then I think the second thing is don't copy and paste. You know, do not go on a course or read a book and think that you are Google or, you know, that small company, like you said, of 30 people. The reality is not so. You know, make everything that you learn implementable within your context of your organization or your team or your space. Yeah, and then I think, like Bia said earlier, you know, we have to do it in an agile way. So small pieces at a time, and then inspect, learn, grow from it, move on, try the next thing.
And just
That
picking up
on my tips.
Just picking up on one of the last things you said around the change management, and that's something in particular that stuck out to me about Old Mutual, is the amount of time, effort, and focus that is put into change management. And it makes the world of a difference in the level of resistance that one experiences. Laura, is there any other tips you would like to add on today?
Yeah, just a couple. But I do want to tag on to Zane's point about, you know, starting where you are. This has to be a context fit change. You know, I spoke about understanding the playing field, knowing what the soil is, therefore you know what fertilizer, how to water, and things like that. What is fit for your space. And so lots of things, depending on that change aptitude, need to be customized potentially for the group. And like Zane said, you know, if you're talking to Exco versus you're talking to the execution teams, how do you translate those things? What works for middle management as well, so that everybody understands their role and the importance of the shift. And I think for us, I think the alignment between strategy and execution, the PMO, has worked really well for us. You know, we got onto the same page relatively quickly, and we saw the benefit that could work. And aligned with that, I think Zane's mentioned a couple of the engagements. So yeah, PI planning, absolutely. Great to have the slot there that sets the tone. So you kind of remind people why they're doing what they're doing and what the outcomes are that we actually want to drive. And then also with the alignment, where we now have an expo session where the underlying information is a strategy tracker report and then a portfolio report. And that allows us to come together and make decisions about stop, start, pivot, persevere. I mean, words that we weren't really using 18 months ago. We haven't landed that silver bullet on prioritization and sequencing. That's probably the next sort of thing that we need to do. But also just the other tip is, you know, for this to work, when you have that triangle with strategy, execution, and also funding, is when do you bring, say, finance or investment committee members on board? Because that shift is also significant, because it changes the way that you allocate money to MVPs and only qualifying for further funding later on. So that shift, I think, needs to start almost simultaneously if you're lucky enough. And then, yeah, like I mentioned before, that core team, you know, that gets really trained, really knowledgeable, becomes the ambassadors and change agents, is also quite important as a tip.
Thank you. I see that we have two questions from audience, both from Liz Fenter. So the first one is a general question: is are PMOs still valid? So that's a free one for all. Yes, you're smiling. Go for it.
I mean, I think in the traditional sense, I think they need to shift. I do believe in a corporate environment. When you talk about maturing agile operations, the PMO plays quite an important role, right? Because we have to align delivery across. And it's quite easy if you have one team delivering and you don't need any integration or coordination work, right? For number one. And also the optimization of the execution, right? The one thing which, you know, you say, where does the change team sit? I think Zane, and I think this is one of the tips, right, is have ownership within the change team. So we talk about the task team that Zane's put together. So there's both the focus on ways of working and the execution. And I think those two are quite close together from their point of view. So long story short, yes, the context of it will change and the processes will change. And whether you're a fan of the word value management office or not, I think that's about delivery of value ultimately. You laugh, Zane.
Yeah, I think that I agree with you, Biase. I don't think that the relevance or validity will go away. PMOs just really have to make a big shift if you are moving towards you know, business agility or new ways of work. I think there will always be room for traditional projects as well. I mean, if things are simple and you know how to do it, you know, you kind of just get on with it. But when things are complex and complicated, then you can't follow those traditional project management methods anymore.
And then another question also from Liz for you, Zane, is do you have a change management program at Old Mutual?
Yes, so we have a big change management competency, if I may call it that. So change management sits within human capital. So within the center, there is a central change area or competency, and then within each segment, they have their own change management areas. And so for this specific change with us for new ways of work, we have a full-time change manager who works with very closely with myself and the task team. She's married to us, and she's literally kind of, you know, walking the journey with us.
So I think that is all that we have time for tonight with regarding questions. But if you would like to know more about lean portfolio management and how we can assist you in possibly adopting it, I will hand back to Biase in a moment. But the first thing I want to say is thank you so much to Zane and Lara for being willing to share with us. I know I've said thank you at least 3 times now, but It's been so much fun, always is. And yeah, so thank you very much. And now to find out more about how we can assist you in learning more about LPM or possibly embarking on this journey, back to you, Biase. Back to you, sitting in Cairo.
I'm on mute, hey?
We almost went the whole time without someone saying that.
Look, I mean, the one thing that we've got to realize, and we need to figure out that this kind of thinking is not that mature. So we talk about agility at scale, scaled agile frameworks, etc. Team delivery is cool. The stuff around working with finance and the complexity around the change is quite difficult. So for us, we've kind of built what we call the Lpm Accelerator. It's an element of what we call a little bit of discovery, understand your maturity. So we run a set of radars to understand where you're at. So it creates a baseline, and then what the important part, as I said, we try to go with the journey with you as a customer. So we co-create the roadmap. It's not us dictating this is the pace in which you need to go, and we come up, as we said, an agile and iterative approach where we continue to review the process. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. That's not the intention of this call. It's about just learning from others. By the way, Lawrence, and I had a meeting with Robert Spears. So, I don't know if you know Robert. So I said to him, like last point, like, we need to focus on an area which we can help the center. So Robert works in the center, what they call the group side. And we spoke like, we're doing with MFC. So don't go to MFC. They're too mature for us. They were like, they're way ahead. So go somewhere else. So I think kudos to you, I think from that point of view. And again, thank you. As a general thing, email us, agility@IQ Business is easier to remember and spell than my name. So use agility@iqbusiness.net or bdegregorio@iqbusiness.net if you want to find out more. Unfortunately, we don't have time to share some of the other things, but maybe we'll have a follow-up session, Natalie.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you, Lara and Zane. Thank you, Josi and Biase. And thank you to you all for joining us. I hope you found it valuable and that you have a lovely evening further. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.